I'm Jordan. I'm Wrangler at Creator Institute, and we're going to be talking about poetry. So we created a lot of new documents for the poetry side of things, and they can be found in the DE Documents Library. We have a lot of new documents on the poetry tools. We have new poetry checklists. All of the poetry tools are on the poetry checklist, so it's directly related. And we also have a new document called Reviewing Poetry When You Don't Like Poetry, which hopefully will be helpful to DEs who maybe get a poet just because we have a surplus, which does happen sometimes. We get a lot of poets. And a DE receives a poet when they haven't really worked with poetry before. It may not happen every cohort, but sometimes we have to put poets with people who don't particularly review poetry all the time. It just is facts of life. So that document will hopefully help you help your poet a little bit better. In that document, we have a lot of tools for you to give advice to the poet on how to actually sit down, draft out a poem, and then also kind of make it better. So please take a look at that. Like I said, it'll be in the DE Documents Library in the poetry folder. There are a couple of things to keep in mind, though, when you're first reviewing a poem. The first thing that you should think about and discuss with your poet is the poet's vision. The poet vision is esoteric. It really changes depending on the poet you're talking to and what that person wants their poem to look like and what they want their poetry collection to look like. So have that conversation with them very early on. You will want to know what exactly their vision for their poetry is, how they want it to come across to the reader, how they feel about it. Is this a cathartic experience for them? Is it something that they want to be really technical about? Kind of dig a little bit about why poetry, and really discover what they want out of their poetry collection. So really help them kind of help you explain their vision and learn their vision, because that's going to be a really important factor in your working relationship. If a poet feels like you don't get them, it's going to be rocky. So really try to get on the same page as early as you can, like first or second call. Really get into their head, and try to figure out what their vision is. Secondly, poetry, we like to think of it as this really ambiguous, artsy kind of thing, but it is a very technical medium. There's a lot of rules, a lot of conventions, and consistency is very important. That's what kind of sets apart like a professional poem from an amateur poem. You want to be really making sure that your poet understands that their writing should be consistent. And by that, I mean the rhyming scheme should be consistent throughout a poem. It doesn't have to be the same from poem to poem, but it does have to remain the same within a single poem. So if you're writing a poem and you're rhyming like A, B, A, the next stanza should not be C, C, D. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. Make sure it's consistent all the way through. That goes for POV and for tenses and everything else that we would check consistency for. It's just extra important in poetry that things remain consistent within a poem. Secondly, help them kind of clean out their language. A lot of new poets have a tendency to really fluff up their word choice because it makes them think that they sound more poetic, which is not true. So try to help them understand that they don't have to be using the thesaurus for every single word that they choose. Have them be a little bit more natural. Help them figure out what words are going to mean the most to them without sounding too lofty. Be a little gentle here. Poets are very particular about their words. And that's fair. It's poetry. You have a very small amount of space to convey a very big message. But just be gentle. Let them know, like, hey, you've used the word ethereal 5 times. Maybe don't. Maybe you could use beautiful, something that you would actually use. The word choice is really important. So make sure that they're using words that they actually use in their life. Next, read things out loud with them. Do it on calls if you can. Obviously, you don't have to do this for everything, but if you're noticing a pattern and like an issue that just keeps popping up, have them either read the poem to you, and you can kind of say, do you hear that? Do you think, do you hear how it doesn't sound quite right? Or you could read it to them and have them kind of come to those conclusions on their own. Obviously, still have those things in your head and be ready to discuss them after you're done reading, but have your poet kind of do a little bit of critical thinking about their own rhythm, their own pace, and everything that goes along with reading a poem out loud. It is a very auditory medium, so it's very important to read it aloud whenever you can. Another thing to keep in mind is to be specific. A lot of poets want to be very in the clouds. Not a bad thing, but for every poem, it doesn't make a ton of sense. You want to ground your reader in specific details and to really help the reader understand what you're trying to get across to them. Avoid generalizations as much as possible. Be very specific in your details and very specific in the ideas you're trying to get across. And if you're worried about having examples to give to your poets about all of these things, we have a lot of examples in that poetry document, reviewing poetry when you don't like poetry, as well as in all of the poetry tools documents. There are examples in there as well. So don't worry, there's plenty of examples. And, kind of most importantly, really, is to help them understand that they're allowed to experiment. Poetry is a very experimental medium. There are a lot of rules, like I said before, and a lot of conventions, but that doesn't mean they can't try to move those expectations around a little bit. Maybe they're doing a sonnet, which has 14 lines normally, if you're doing a Shakespearean sonnet. Those 14 lines can be, in the rhyme scheme of a sonnet and, all of that. But what if you used very modern language? What if you made it more of like a rap? You could experiment with your form, you can experiment with your content. It doesn't need to just be, oh, I'm writing poetry and now it's time to do a syllable here and an unstressed one here and what's the meter. It doesn't have to be exhausting. So just for first drafts, let them play around, let them have fun. And then once you start really revising things, help them be consistent, help them really ground their poetry, and, just help them refine their vision. That's the ultimate goal. Is first drafts are for having fun, and you'll likely get to a lot of second drafts because poetry happens very quickly. And with the second drafts, help them really refine what they have in front of them. We also have, if you're someone who doesn't know a ton of poetry terminology, we also have a terminology document. Again, in the poetry folder in DE Documents Library. You could share that with your writer, copy it, and then share it. Don't just share it, please. You can give that to your writer as well, and they can further, help themselves kind of figure out what poetry is with just like the terms. If they're going to research poetry at all, they should have like a basic understanding of the terminology, because they can get pretty confusing pretty fast if you just kind of go off into the internet and look up how to write a poem, and then it shoots meter at you, it shoots feet at you, like it's nuts. So that's a document for them to use as well. And lastly, if you are like, you have no examples, you don't know where to start, you don't know how to help the writer. Poetry Foundation is a really great website, and their search function is nuts. You can, search for a poem based on the topic. And poetry.org is very similar, or poets.org, excuse me. It's a very similar idea. Their search function is crazy because poetry is, very specific. So they have search engines that really help you find the exact kind of poem that you're looking for. So use those as resources, and come to us as well, Wranglers, and people that are very good at poetry, or kind of specialize in it within the DE group. We have a couple of, poetry people. So reach out whenever you can if you're struggling. But we have a lot of tools. We're here to help. So don't be scared. It's just a poem. You'll do okay. But thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your training.